You're
The
certain you
pile was
raked through
taller than
everything.
Callie Beckett was,
I have reason
sitting
to
at the
believe
edge of the
something
town
important is in
park in
here.
Sawtooth
It's just
Junction,
a pile of
Colorado,
leaves, ma'am.
smoking faintly at one end, where somebody from the Parks Department had already put a match to the outer edge of it. It was late September. The aspens up the ridge had gone the color of egg yolks, and the whole heap smelled like a campfire that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be a bonfire. It was, Callie realized, standing there in her mother's barn coat with a coffee going cold in her hand, several $1,000s worth of pine cones. Nobody else in Sawtooth Junction would have described it that way. Everybody else called it yard waste. Callie was 27, dry-humored in the specific way of a person who has recently had a very expensive plan fall apart, and she had been back home for 5 months. The plan had been a marketing job in Denver that came with a start date, a signing bonus, and a company that folded before she ever got either. She'd sublet her apartment to a stranger off the internet who then stopped paying rent, and by the time the lease untangled itself, she had $1,100, a used Subaru with bald tires, and nowhere to go but her parents' place at the edge of town, in the shadow of the same ridge she'd grown up staring at out her bedroom window. Her mother, Donna Beckett, had converted Callie's old room into a scrapbooking room approximately 4 days after Callie moved to Denver, so Callie was sleeping on a pullout in what the family still called the sun porch, though it had no sun in it after about 3 in the afternoon this time of year. Her father, Cal Beckett, ran the hardware store on Main Street and had the permanent, patient expression of a man who has spent 30 years explaining to customers that duct tape is not, in fact, a substitute for a hose clamp. Her brother Finn was 16, technically still in high school, and operated at a baseline emotional setting that could be described as unbothered. A kid who considered enthusiasm a tactical error, and had been that way since roughly the 4th grade. "You're just going to stand there and look at garbage," Finn said, when she made him come with her to the park that morning. He was slouched against the tailgate of Cal's truck, hood up against the cold, holding his phone like it might rescue him. "This is the whole plan? Staring at trash?" "It's not trash," Callie said. "It's inventory." "It's on fire, Callie." "It's not on fire. It's smoldering. There's a difference. And also that's the part I'm not taking." Dwight Fowler, the town's groundskeeper for going on 20 years, ambled over from the maintenance shed with a rake over one shoulder and the look of a man who had seen every possible variety of townsperson foolishness and thought he'd cataloged them all. Dwight was somewhere north of 60, built like a fence post, and had a mustache that had clearly been the same mustache since the Reagan administration. "Help you, Callie?" "I want the pine cones, Dwight." Dwight looked at the pile, then at Callie, then at the pile again, as if checking it hadn't changed into something else while he wasn't looking. "You want the pine cones, the ones we're burning." "That's the whole point, Dwight. Try to keep up." "We burn these every year," Dwight said slowly, the way you'd explain something to a large dog. "Rake 'em off the trail, off the lawn, up along the sledding hill, pile 'em here, and the Forest Service does the same, up past the trailhead, and then we burn the lot so it doesn't turn into a fire hazard come spring, when it's all dried out, and some kid drops a match in it. Been doing it since before you were born." "I know. I want it instead of you burning it. All of it, every year, if you'll let me." "It's pine cones." "It's pine cones," Callie agreed. Dwight looked at her a long moment, the way you look at weather that doesn't match the forecast, and then he shrugged, because ultimately it was less work for him. "Take what you want. Save me the trouble of hauling half of it. Wouldn't tell your mother, though, is my advice. She's gonna ask what you're up to. She already knows I don't have a job, Dwight. This can only be an improvement." She loaded the bed of Cal's truck with as many contractor bags of pine cones as it would hold, with Finn complaining the entire time that his hands smelled like Christmas and he hated Christmas, which was a lie everybody in the family knew was a lie, and drove home to the garage, where the whole operation, though nobody used that word yet, would live for the next 10 weeks. Here was the idea, and it wasn't complicated, which was sort of the point. A dry pine cone is full of resin, the same sticky sap that makes a pine tree smell like a pine tree. and resin catches fire fast and burns hot and steady, hotter and longer than a sheet of newspaper, which is why campers had been tucking pine cones under kindling for about as long as there'd been campfires. Dip that cone in wax and you get something even better. A fire starter that lights in one match, burns for 8 or 10 minutes instead of 2, and throws enough sustained heat to get actual firewood going, even if the wood's a little damp, which in a mountain town, where everybody heated at least partly with a wood stove or a fireplace, from October clear through April, was not a small thing. People bought bags of manufactured fire starters at the hardware store. Her own father sold them, $7 for a dozen sad little sawdust pucks, and Callie was standing in front of a literal mountain of the raw material for free, being set on fire for no reason at all. Okay, she told Finn, that first night, spreading a tarp over the garage floor while Ember, the family's scruffy and profoundly obsessive mutt, supervised from atop a pile of dog beds she'd dragged in from 3 different rooms. Here's the deal. I need help. I'll cut you in. Cut me in on what? Pine cones? On the money. There's no money. There's a truck full of garbage and you talking like a TED Talk. 15%. 25. You haven't done anything yet. Neither have you, Finn said, which was fair, and which was how Finn Beckett became, against every fiber of his professed disinterest, a business partner. The first batch was a disaster, and it was a disaster for a specific and instructive reason. Callie had gathered the cones straight off the pile, some of them singed at the edges, most of them still closed up tight like fists, because they'd sat under snow and rain most of the winter before, and had only been raked up a few weeks earlier. A closed pine cone is a wet pine cone. Structurally, the scales close up in humidity to protect the seeds inside, and open up when things dry out, which is also, conveniently, exactly the shape you want for a fire starter, because open scales catch flame and burn easier and let the wax get down into all the nooks instead of just coating the outside like a shell. Callie didn't know any of this yet. She just dipped the cones as they were, closed and slightly damp, into a pot of wax melted on the stove, let them cool on a wire rack in the garage, and felt, for about 6 hours, like a woman on the verge of an actual business. Then she tried to light one in the fireplace, in front of Cal and Donna, with the mild theatrical flourish of someone unveiling a magic trick, and it produced a sad hiss, a thread of black smoke, and no flame whatsoever. The wax had sealed the closed cone up like a candle with no wick, trapping the moisture inside instead of burning it off. Well, Cal said, in the gentle tone he used when a customer had just tried to return a chainsaw with no receipt. It's got a real ambiance to it. Worse, days later, sorting through the ones that hadn't been touched by wax yet, still waiting their turn on the drying rack, Callie found 2 of them crawling with tiny dark beetles, and let out a shriek that brought Donna running from the kitchen, convinced somebody had lost a finger to the table saw. There are bugs in the pine cones, Donna said, holding a dish towel to her chest, like a woman fending off a home invasion. Callie, there are bugs, living in my garage. They were already there, Mom. I didn't invite them. I don't care whose idea it was. Get them out of my garage. That was lesson number 1, and it turned out to be the most important lesson of the whole enterprise. Pine cones, before they touch wax, have to be fully dry and fully open, and they have to be baked. Callie found this out at 1 in the morning, deep in a YouTube rabbit hole of homesteading videos and dusty forum threads with usernames like WoodstoveWendy88, after Finn had gone to bed insisting the whole thing was cursed. You spread the cones on a baking sheet, 1 layer deep, and put them in the oven at around 200 degrees for an hour or 2. Low and slow, never higher, because pine sap is flammable, and cones left too long or too hot in an oven can scorch or worse. That low heat did 3 things at once. It drove out any lingering moisture so the cone wouldn't steam and smoke under the wax later. It forced the scales to open all the way so the cone looked like the pretty full-bloom thing you picture when you picture a pine cone, and it baked out any bugs still living inside before it ever got near her house, her wax, or her mother's dish towels. "You're baking the trash now," Finn said, the next afternoon, watching 3 trays of pine cones go into the oven, like Callie was prepping a Thanksgiving turkey. "In the oven we eat food out of. We're not eating out of it while there's cones in it, genius. Mom's gonna think we're doing a science fair project." Mom already thinks that. I heard her on the phone with Aunt Ruthie. The second disaster was worse, because it was the kind that could have burned the garage down. Impatient to move faster, Callie had started melting wax directly in a saucepan on the stove burner instead of using a double boiler, a pot of water with a second pot or bowl set inside it, so the wax gets heated gently by steam instead of direct flame. Wax has a flash point, a temperature at which it stops melting politely and starts producing vapor that can catch fire on its own, especially over direct heat, where you get hot spots. She'd stepped away for maybe 90 seconds to answer the door for a UPS delivery, and came back to find the wax smoking hard and the edge of it starting to flicker, with an actual small flame licking up the inside of the pan. She didn't panic, mostly because Ember started barking in a register Callie had never heard from her before, which snapped her back into the room fast. She remembered, barely, from some safety video she'd half-watched, not to throw water on a grease or wax fire, because water on burning oil just explodes it outward, and instead slid a metal lid over the pan and killed the burner, and the flame smothered itself in about 4 seconds flat. She sat down on the garage floor afterward, and let her hands shake for a minute. Finn, arriving at a dead sprint because he'd heard the dog going off, found her sitting there with the pot lid still clutched in one hand. "Are you dying? I almost burned down the garage. Can I still get my 25% if you're dead? Get out." From then on it was a double boiler, always, and she never once left it unattended. Not even for the UPS guy, not even for Ember standing at the door doing her most soulful impression of a dog who had never once in her life been fed. The wax itself was its own small education. Buying brand new wax by the case was too expensive for the volume she needed, so she'd been collecting old candle stubs and cheap thrift store candles to melt down, which sounded thrifty and turned out to be filthy. Every batch of recycled wax came out full of old wick fragments, bits of dye, occasional flakes of glass from candles that had cracked. She learned to pour the melted wax through a fine mesh strainer, then a second time through a layer of cheesecloth, before it ever touched a cone, because a stray inch of old cotton wick embedded in a fire starter was, at minimum, an ugly surprise and, at worst, a fire hazard nobody asked for. Temperature was its own argument, one she and Finn had almost nightly, standing over the pot with a cheap candy thermometer clipped to the side. "It's too thin," Finn said, holding up a dipped cone that had come out looking glazed and translucent, wax running down into a puddle on the rack, instead of sitting on the cone in a nice thick coat. "Look, it's basically bald. That's because the wax was too hot. It has to be around 160, 170 degrees, not boiling. Well, now it's 100 and clumping. Look at this one. It looks like a snowball hit by a truck. That means it's too cool. It's setting before it coats evenly. We have to reheat it." It took a dozen ruined cones and most of a Tuesday night before they had it dialed in. Dip fast, hold 2 seconds, let it drip. Set it on parchment, not the wire rack, because the wire rack left cooling wax with tiny grooved lines that looked, in Finn's words, diseased. Then there was the wick. A fire starter with no wick was just a waxed pine cone you had to hold a lighter to for 30 seconds, hoping. Callie started tying a length of jute twine around the base of each cone before dipping, letting a couple inches hang free, so a single match to the twine would catch and carry the flame straight into the resin-soaked scales. Cotton wick worked too, but jute was cheaper, rustic-looking, and, this actually mattered, burned slightly slower, giving the fire more time to transfer into the cone itself, instead of just torching the string and going out. And then, because a fire starter that looked beautiful and didn't actually start a fire was worthless, she made herself test every design the boring way, in the actual fireplace, with actual kindling, timing it on her phone. A good one needed to catch on the first match and burn a minimum of 6 to 8 minutes, long enough to get split kindling going even if it was a little damp, which around Sawtooth Junction in November it usually was. Some early versions burned out in 90 seconds, a bright showy fizzle that looked great and did nothing. She kept records, actual records, a notebook Finn mocked her for keeping, of wax type, dip count, wick length, and burn time, until she had something that worked the same way 9 times out of 10. The last discovery was the fun one. Plain wax Firestarters looked, frankly, like something you'd find at the bottom of a toolbox. Callie started adding a spoonful of ground cinnamon to the wax for color and scent, or a few drops of orange and clove essential oil, or tucking a dried orange slice against the cone before the final dip so it looked like it belonged on a Christmas mantle instead of next to a wood splitter. She tinted one batch a deep red with candle dye, and it came out looking, Donna admitted grudgingly from the kitchen doorway, actually kind of gorgeous, Callie. I'll give you that, which was the first compliment the operation had received from anyone over 18. By the third week of October, the garage smelled permanently of cinnamon, orange peel, and hot wax. A smell so strong that Cal said walking in from the cold felt like getting mugged by a Yankee Candle. Ember had, by this point, developed what Finn accurately called a genuinely unhinged fixation on the raw pine cones. She considered every cone on every drying tray to be a personal gift left out for her by a benevolent universe, and she stole them constantly, snatching one off a rack the exact instant Callie's back was turned, trotting off to bury it in the yard with the solemn dedication of a dog conducting a funeral. Callie found buried pine cones in the flower bed, under the porch steps, once inside one of Cal's work boots left by the back door. Ember also had a habit of presenting Callie with the soggiest, most slobbered-upon cone she could find at the exact worst moment. Mid-dip, mid-phone call, once directly into Callie's lap while she was counting cash from the first farmer's market table, dropping it with an expression of enormous pride, as if she alone understood the true purpose of the business, and everyone else was simply getting in the way. She's basically an employee, Finn said, except she takes inventory instead of packing it. She's a liability. She buried $4 of pine cones in the yard this week. So she's exactly as useful as me then. The first sale happened almost by accident, at the Sawtooth Junction Farmers Market's final weekend of the season, tucked into a corner table Callie hadn't even paid full price for, because the market coordinator felt bad for her showing up with a hand-lettered sign that said Firestarters, cinnamon or plain, $6 a bag of 4. She sold 11 bags in 3 hours, mostly to people buying them as a novelty, and made $66 against maybe $40 of wax, wick, and gas money, which was not exactly a fortune, but was the first money either of the Beckett kids had made off pine cones, instead of asking their parents for gas cash. And it felt, Callie said later, like being paid to be right. Lonnie Dietz, a diner regular who'd known Callie since she was in braces, started up on her the following Monday at the counter of the Junction Diner, where Callie had taken a few breakfast shifts to cover the wax bill. How's the pinecone empire, Callie? Lit anybody's money on fire yet? Every dollar, Lonnie, straight into the fireplace. Your daddy tells me you got bugs crawling out of the things. That was one batch, 3 weeks ago, and you're never gonna let it go, are you? Not for a long while, no. Tam Sisson, who ran a home and gift shop downtown called Cedar and Pine, a name Callie found almost insultingly fitting, stopped by the market table on a whim and bought a bag for herself, tried one in her own wood stove that night, and called Callie the next morning, asking if she had 40 more bags she could put on the shelf before Thanksgiving. Callie did not have 40 more bags. Callie had 4, but she told Tam yes, and then spent the next 5 nights in the garage, with Finn dipping cones until 2 in the morning on school nights, an arrangement Donna only tolerated because Finn's grades, against all odds, had not moved an inch in either direction. The Cedar and Pine basket sold out in 4 days. Tam reordered, doubled the order, and put a little card next to the display that said, Local, made in Sawtooth Junction, perfect stocking stuffer. and somebody took a photograph of that display. Cinnamon-dusted cones stacked in a wire basket with sprigs of real pine tucked around them, and posted it online with a caption about supporting small local makers before the holidays. And the photograph did the thing photographs sometimes do in late November, which is travel much farther than anyone intended. Orders started arriving through a hastily built order form Finn had actually set up himself, a fact he would mention approximately 400 times over the following month. Then came the call that changed the shape of the whole thing. A regional home goods buyer named Grady Wexler, who ran seasonal purchasing for a chain of 7 stores across the mountain corridor, had seen the same photograph forwarded to him by an employee and wanted 600 units delivered before December 15th, at a wholesale price that, once Callie sat with the notebook and actually worked the real cost of wax, wick, jars, labor, and gas against it, came out to enough money to cover the family's winter heating bill, Callie's car repairs, and Christmas, with room left over. 600, Finn said, staring at the number on the screen like it might rearrange itself into something more reasonable. We don't have 600 pine cones dipped. We have 600 pine cones buried in the yard by ember. We have 3 weeks. We have 3 weeks and 1 dog actively working against us. They said yes. Of course they said yes. And for 4 days it looked like the best month of Callie Beckett's adult life. Then came the phone call from Denise Krogh. Denise was the county fire marshal, a woman in her 50s with a calm, procedural voice that gave away nothing about whether she was about to ruin your week, and it turned out she was, in fact, about to ruin Callie's week, though not out of any particular malice. A complaint had come in, nobody ever told Callie who, and it genuinely didn't matter, about a home-based business selling an unlabeled combustible product with no fire safety testing, no child warning label, and no documentation of what materials exactly were involved. Denise was polite about it, almost apologetic, but entirely unmovable. Callie was to stop selling immediately, effective that day, until the product met basic safety compliance, proper labeling, safe packaging, and a demonstration that the materials themselves weren't a hazard beyond the ordinary hazard of, well, being a fire starter. You're shutting me down 11 days before Christmas, Callie said, standing in the garage with a phone against her ear, and 400 cinnamon-scented pine cones drying on trays around her, like a courtroom full of silent witnesses. I'm not trying to end your business, Miss Beckett. I'm telling you what has to happen before you can keep running it. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one today. It felt, that day, exactly like the plan in Denver folding all over again. Something good, arriving at last, yanked back at the exact moment it was real. Donna found her sitting on the garage floor that night, in almost the same spot she'd sat in after the near fire, except this time it wasn't fear, it was just tired. And Ember climbed into her lap uninvited, with a pine cone already clamped in her jaws, which Callie took, wordlessly, and set beside her like a small, damp trophy. You could just quietly keep selling out of the trunk, Finn offered. Who's gonna know? Denise Krogh is going to know, because Denise Krogh already knows my name, my address, and apparently my Instagram. So what do? We do it right, Callie said, and got up off the floor. She called Denise back the next morning, not to argue but to ask plainly what right actually looked like, and Denise, surprised, Callie thought, that anyone ever called back without a lawyer, walked her through it point by point. The wick and any packaging materials touching the wax had to be checked against basic flammability standards. Nothing treated with anything that could produce toxic smoke. The label needed clear, specific warning language. For lighting fires only, keep away from children, store in a cool, dry place, do not leave burning unattended. The product needed to be packaged so it couldn't ignite accidentally in transport or storage. No loose cones rattling in a paper sack, but a proper sealed bag or box that kept them apart and kept stray heat sources out. And Denise wanted to witness, personally, an actual burn test. Several units, lit under observation, timed, to confirm they behaved the way Callie claimed they did and didn't do anything unpredictable, like spitting or flaring. Callie spent 2 days rewriting the whole label from scratch at the kitchen table, with Cal, of all people, leaning over her shoulder with genuine interest for the first time in the whole enterprise, because label compliance turned out to be a language Cal Beckett spoke fluently from 3 decades of selling hardware. "You need a batch number," he said. "In case something's wrong with one lot, you need to know which lot it was. That's actually smart. I've been telling you that about myself for years." They ordered proper craft paper bags instead of the flimsy ones, self-sealing, with the warning label printed directly on the front instead of taped as an afterthought, and Callie switched the wick source to a plain, untreated jute cord specifically rated as low residue, nothing dipped in anything else first. On a cold Thursday morning, Denise Krogh stood in the Beckett's driveway with a clipboard while Callie lit 6 fire starters, one at a time, in a metal fire pit, timing each one on her phone, in front of a county official, the way she'd once timed them alone, in the living room fireplace at midnight. All 6 caught on the first match. All 6 burned between 7 and 9 minutes, steady and contained, no flaring, no spitting, no surprises. Denise signed off on the spot. "For what it's worth," she said, folding her clipboard shut. "Most people I do this with get angry at me. You just asked what you needed to fix and fixed it. That's rarer than you'd think. 600 units due Monday will make anybody focus fast. Good luck with your 600 units, Miss Beckett." The compliance sticker, a small printed seal Callie added to every bag that read, "Tested and verified safe, county certified," turned out to be an accidental gift. What could have sunk her became, on Tam Sisson's shelf and in Grady Wexler's stores alike, a selling point nobody else in the Firestarter aisle could claim. Not just pretty, not just local, but actually tested, actually safe, made right. Grady Wexler's order shipped 4 days before the deadline. 600 units packed in labeled craft bags, cinnamon and orange clove, and one plain unscented line for people who found scented candles suspicious on principle, which Lonnie Dietz bought exactly to prove a point, and then quietly reordered twice. By the second week of December, the whole run was sold out across all 7 of Grady's stores and Tam's shop besides. Weeks before the season was properly finished, weeks before the first hard snow had even settled in for good. Dwight Fowler started setting cones aside for her instead of piling them for burning, stacking them in feed bags behind the maintenance shed with a masking tape label that said Beckett in block letters. And when a reporter from the county paper came around to do a small write-up on it, Dwight told her, with the closest thing to pride his face was built for, 20 years I burned these things. Never once thought to ask what they were good for. Kid did. Lonnie Dietz still asked her every morning how the Empire was doing, and Callie still told him she was one match away from burning it all down, and he still laughed like it was the first time. Donna, who had spent October mortified at the smell and the bugs and the pile of contractor bags clogging up her garage, spent December telling every customer at Cal's hardware counter that her daughter ran a Firestarter business now, tested and certified, thank you, as if she'd invented compliance herself. Finn, for his part, had fully rewritten history by Christmas Eve, telling anyone who'd listen that he'd basically built the whole business. The website, he'd note, conveniently omitting the pine cones, the wax, the burns, the failures, and roughly 90% of the actual dipping, and Callie let him have it, mostly, because his cut had gone from a theoretical 25% of nothing to a very real quarter of something, and he'd earned at least some of the insufferability that came with it. Ember, unbothered by fire marshals, wholesale orders, or compliance stickers, kept right on stealing pine cones straight off the drying racks through the entire month of December, burying them in a snowbank by the porch with the same devotion she'd shown in September, apparently unconvinced that the operation had ever been about anything other than her. The pile at the park never got burned again. Every fall since, Dwight Fowler rakes it up and calls Callie before he calls anybody else, and the town that once watched a broke 27-year-old haul garbage bags of pine cones out of a smoking heap now tells visitors, with a straight face, that they always knew she had something. If you enjoyed this one, like and subscribe for more true stories like it. And tell us in the comments about something everyone around you called worthless that turned out to be worth a fortune.